So you want to run the United Nations. First, you need 193 governments to approve a regular budget of $3.45 billion for 2026. Then you need those same governments to actually pay it on time, which they often do not. That is the first trick of the UN. From the outside, it looks like a giant global superstate. In cash terms, the core machine is smaller than plenty of private companies. The real problem is not raising the money. The real problem is turning that money into legitimacy, access, and just enough order to stop expensive chaos from spreading across borders. What does the UN actually sell? Why does a system with a $3.45 billion regular budget sit next to peacekeeping bills of $5.38 billion, and agencies that can raise far more than either one? And why do governments keep funding an institution they publicly complain about almost every year? Because the UN is not really in the business of peace. It is in the business of coordination with diplomatic branding attached. The entry barrier is absurd if you think like a founder, and obvious if you think like a state. Under Article 17, member states are assessed for the expenses of the organization as apportioned by the General Assembly. In plain English, the owners are the customers, and the customers write the rules. To control the core UN, you do not buy equity. You buy influence through votes, assessed dues, committee seats, and years of bureaucratic positioning. The legal gatekeepers are the General Assembly and its budget machinery, especially the Fifth Committee, and the timeline is measured in annual budget cycles, multi-year negotiations, and sometimes decades of diplomatic accumulation. If you want to alter the core budget, the peacekeeping envelope, or the language attached to a mission, you are not looking at a 6-month startup sprint. You are looking at an 18 to 36-month fight, if you are lucky, and a 10-year grind if you are not. The faster path is to stop trying to control the whole building and fund the parts that already need cash. That is how serious players really move the system. The World Food Program alone recorded total contributions of $9,759,124,151 for 2024. UNICEF received $8.26 billion in contributions in 2024. That is the backdoor assessed money, keeps the lights on. Voluntary money steers where the furniture goes. If a donor wants speed, branding, and leverage, it does not wait for 193 flags to agree. It writes a targeted check to an agency, a trust fund, or an emergency appeal, and suddenly has much more influence over what gets prioritized on the ground. Geography makes the model even stranger. In New York, the UN is committee language, voting blocks, and budget haggling over line items. In Eastern Congo, it looks like armored vehicles, aviation support, fuel, barracks, contractors, and one of the largest peacekeeping logistics chains on Earth. The approved peacekeeping budget for the fiscal year from the 1st of July 2024 to the 30th of June 2025 was $5.6 billion. In other words, the same institution that can spend months arguing over wording in Manhattan can also function like a field operator with billions in deployed costs once the mission lands in a conflict zone. Same brand, totally different economics. The counterintuitive number is this. The regular budget that gets all the headlines is not even the main event. One UN agency, WFP, pulled in almost $9.8 billion in 2024 by itself. UNICEF added another $8.26 billion. And according to one financing overview, the UN system's total expenses reached $68.5 billion in 2023. So when people talk about the UN as if it is one single pot of money, they are missing the structure completely. The famous blue flag sits on top of a loose financial empire made of assessed dues, voluntary donations, earmarked funds, emergency appeals, and mission budgets that behave very differently from each other. Funny coincidence. The part everyone thinks is all-powerful is often the least liquid. That matters because the safety net is thin and selective. The core UN can assess dues, pressure late payers, and in bad years raid its own reserves. A Pew analysis noted the organization borrowed a record $607 million from reserve accounts in 2024. That is the equivalent of a landlord paying this month's electricity bill by emptying the security deposit jar. It works once. It does not solve the business model. Peacekeeping has its own assessed stream. Agencies like WFP and UNICEF depend heavily on voluntary contributions. And voluntary money is useful right up until donors attach conditions, delay disbursements, or decide that today's humanitarian emergency is politically inconvenient. The safety net covers temporary cash flow. It does not cover trust, unanimity, or donor fatigue. So why would anyone do this? Why would governments pour billions into a machine that moves slowly, gets blamed for everything, and cannot even force its members to behave? Because the real product is not peacekeeping troops or speeches in New York. The real product is cost-sharing with legitimacy attached. The UN lets states pool money, outsource moral responsibility, and distribute risk under a neutral label. If a government acts alone, it pays the full military, legal, reputational, and administrative price. If it acts through the UN, it pays a fraction of the cash and gets a multilateral logo on the invoice. That logo matters. It lowers political cost at home, softens accusations abroad, and gives governments something invaluable in international politics. Cover. Here is the simple version. Imagine a government faces a regional crisis that would cost $200 million to monitor, feed displaced civilians, and support negotiations on its own. Instead, it commits $20 million to a UN mechanism. Another 9 governments do the same. The UN now has $200 million, plus procurement systems, field staff, legal status, local partnerships, and the diplomatic fiction that this is a collective response, rather than one country throwing its weight around. That government has effectively bought 1/10 of the bill while still shaping the outcome. Not bad for a system that gets to invoice sovereign panic by committee. Scale that up and the numbers get even cleaner. The peacekeeping budget approved for 2025 to 2026 was $5.38 billion. The regular budget for 2026 was $3.45 billion. WFP alone took in nearly $9.8 billion in 2024. UNICEF took in $8.26 billion. Put together, that means states are not funding one institution. They are funding layers of outsourcing. Security outsourcing, aid outsourcing, procurement outsourcing, diplomatic blame outsourcing. The UN looks inefficient until you compare it with what unilateral action would cost politically and financially. Then it starts to look like wholesale pricing for international legitimacy. There is also a second revenue logic hiding inside the system, and it is less glamorous. The UN creates enormous procurement and contractor demand. Missions need airlift, food, shelters, telecoms, medical supplies, translation, security infrastructure, and local staffing. Agencies need software, warehousing, consultants, audits, and distribution networks. The public sees resolutions. Vendors see invoices. If a humanitarian agency receives $100 million for an emergency response, a large chunk will move through transport, procurement, fuel, warehousing, and operational support before a single sack of grain reaches a family. The UN does not keep profits like a corporation. But entire private ecosystems make very normal profits serving its very abnormal needs. Then there is the scandal tax. The most famous case is the Oil for Food program in Iraq. The program moved more than $64 billion in Iraqi oil proceeds and was supposed to convert sanctioned oil sales into humanitarian goods. Instead, investigations later tied it to $229 million in illegal surcharges on oil contracts and $1.5 billion in kickbacks on humanitarian contracts. That is $1.729 billion in distortions wrapped around a program designed to feed civilians under sanctions. The scandal did not prove the UN invented corruption. It proved that when you build a giant multilateral cash channel between desperate populations, sanctioned governments, and politically protected intermediaries, someone will treat it like a buffet. The outcome was reputational damage, reform language, and a reminder that oversight always arrives after the money learns how the corridor works. The darker case study is more recent and more revealing because it exposes the actual fragility of the model. On the 26th of January, 2024, the United States paused funding to UNRWA after allegations involving some of its staff. Reuters reported that even if the pause had been lifted, only about $300,000 in already appropriated funds would have been immediately releasable. Reuters also noted that the United States had been UNRWA's biggest donor, providing roughly $300 million to $400 million a year. Within days, more countries paused support. In 2023, more than 70 governments and organizations had pledged $1.46 billion to UNRWA. In theory, that looks diversified. In practice, the system was still highly exposed to a handful of political decisions taken over a single weekend. One donor pause became a global liquidity shock. That is the part people miss. A humanitarian institution can feed millions for years and still live one cabinet decision away from a cash crisis. The lesson is ugly but useful. First, multilateral funding is only as stable as the politics of its largest donors. Second, voluntary money buys flexibility until the donor decides flexibility now belongs to them. Third, institutions that look global are often financially concentrated in ways that would terrify any private investor. And fourth, the most dangerous risk to the UN is usually not the villain everyone imagines storming a conference hall. It is a spreadsheet problem in Washington, Berlin, Brussels, or Riyadh. One final number reframes the whole thing. Almost 3/4 of total UN revenue, 72% in one financing overview, came from direct government contributions. Not consumer demand, not market competition, not earned income. Governments funding a machine that exists largely to manage the consequences of governments. That is the closed loop. States create wars, displacement, sanctions, famine exposure, and diplomatic deadlock. Then states fund the UN to process the damage at scale. Then they complain about the bill. Then they pay just enough to keep the machine alive, because the alternative is paying much more alone. Put it all together and the economics behind the United Nations are brutally simple. It exists because the world needs a place where sovereign states can socialize costs without surrendering full control. Rich states get leverage without overt occupation. Smaller states get a microphone they could never afford on their own. Contractors get demand. Agencies get earmarked money. Politicians get moral cover. And populations trapped in crisis get help that is often delayed, compromised, and still better than nothing. The UN is not a world government. It is a cost-sharing platform for a planet that does not trust itself enough to build one. So what does the financial breakdown look like in practice? At the small end, imagine a mid-sized donor state putting $25 million a year into a targeted UN fund instead of mounting its own $120 million bilateral response. It gets visibility, field access, procurement already in place, and a seat in the room for roughly 1/5 of the standalone price. At the large end, imagine a top-tier donor influencing the system across the regular budget, peacekeeping, and agency funding by committing $1 billion plus across multiple channels. That state is not buying ownership. It is buying agenda access, burden sharing, and the right to shape crises without carrying the full flag alone. For private firms inside the ecosystem, the math is even plainer. A small translation or compliance contractor clearing a $2 million annual UN contract at a 12% margin makes $240,000. A large logistics operator handling $120 million in mission support at an 8% margin clears $9.6 million. Same institution, very different ways to get paid. And that is the joke at the center of the whole enterprise. The United Nations is what happens when 193 governments decide the cheapest way to manage global disorder is to rent legitimacy from themselves.